The transmission lasted exactly 7 minutes, and for a long moment after it ended, no one across the galaxy knew how to respond, not because it was encrypted or difficult to understand, but because it was so simple it felt unreal. A human stood at the center of the broadcast, no armor, no visible rank, no sign of fear, and calmly declared war on every hostile galactic force before the signal cut off without drama, without threat, without explanation. For 12 full seconds, silence followed across thousands of systems, and then the laughter began. Empires that had crushed civilizations older than Earth dismissed it as a joke. Military commanders replayed the message for entertainment, and analysts marked humanity as a harmless anomaly. Their classification had never changed: weak, divided, technologically limited, barely capable of maintaining a stable presence beyond their own system. There was no reason to take them seriously, no evidence they could project power, no history of large-scale conflict beyond their own world. And yet, beneath a mountain range that did not officially exist, a countdown reached 0. Deep underground, in a facility hidden from every known sensor, a network activated in perfect synchronization, systems aligning across continents and orbital layers with silent precision. Ethan Cole stood alone in a dim control room, watching as countless indicators shifted from standby to active. His expression calm, almost detached, as if this moment had already happened in his mind 1,000 times. He gave a single command, execute, and the galaxy began to go dark. Communication relays that had functioned flawlessly for centuries blinked once and vanished, not destroyed but erased so completely that even their backups ceased to exist. At first, the disruption seemed like routine interference, minor delays that could be explained away, but within seconds entire sectors lost contact with one another, fleets found themselves cut off from command, and empires that depended on instant coordination suddenly became isolated fragments. Confusion spread faster than panic, because no one understood what they were looking at. There were no attacks, no visible enemies, no warnings beyond the message that had already been dismissed. Then came the second phase. On the edges of known space, distant outposts began to register anomalies, small distortions that appeared and vanished too quickly to track, objects that moved without following any known trajectory. Before anyone could respond, those outposts disappeared. Not damaged, not destroyed, simply gone, leaving behind empty space where structure and life had existed seconds before. Reports trickled in slowly due to the communication collapse, fragmented pieces of information that made no sense on their own but formed a terrifying pattern when combined. Entire installations were vanishing without a trace, and no defensive system had activated in time to respond. Back in the Keth Dominion, High Chancellor Marcus Viril watched the scattered data with growing unease, his earlier skepticism fading as the scale of the disruption became clear. This was not random failure, not coincidence, and certainly not a prank. Something precise, something deliberate, was dismantling the galaxy's infrastructure with impossible accuracy. On Earth, Ethan glanced at the timer as it dropped below 6 minutes, the operation unfolding exactly as planned, every second accounted for, every reaction anticipated. Humanity had not declared war out of desperation or arrogance. They had declared it because, by the time the message ended, the war had already begun. The first confirmed encounter came from a Keth patrol operating near the Outer Rim, where a single human vessel drifted into sensor range with such a weak signature that it was almost ignored. The patrol captain ordered a scan, expecting debris or a malfunctioning probe, but the results identified it as a manned craft, small and completely unremarkable by every measurable standard. It had no visible weapons, no shield output worth noting, and no accompanying fleet, a lone ship sitting calmly in hostile territory as if it had every right to be there. The crew reacted exactly as expected, with amusement rather than concern, the earlier declaration of war still fresh in their minds as a source of entertainment rather than alarm. A channel was opened, and after a brief moment of static, a human appeared on the main display, his expression composed, his posture relaxed, his eyes steady in a way that felt strangely out of place. When the captain demanded an explanation, the human simply said, "You should leave." The response triggered laughter across the bridge, disbelief turning the situation into something almost absurd. The captain dismissed the warning and ordered a disabling strike, intending to capture the vessel for analysis. The first shot landed perfectly, a controlled burst designed to cripple systems without destroying the ship. It had no effect. Confusion replaced amusement as a second, stronger strike was fired, followed by a third, each one connecting with absolute precision and achieving nothing. The human ship did not move, did not respond, did not even register the impact in any observable way. The captain's tone shifted from amused to irritated, and he ordered a full barrage. The fleet unleashed its combined firepower, flooding the area with enough energy to annihilate a much larger target. Yet when the assault ended, the human vessel remained exactly as it had been before, untouched and unmoved. Then, without warning, the attacking ships lost control. Weapons shut down simultaneously, targeting systems failed, and navigation froze as if an invisible force had reached inside every system and turned it off. Panic spread as the crew struggled to regain control, their commands ignored by systems that no longer responded. The human on the screen watched silently before speaking again, his voice calm and almost sympathetic. "We warned you." When the captain accused him of declaring war on the entire galaxy, the human corrected him in a tone that carried no emotion at all. "We declared war on your systems." In the next instant, the human ship vanished, not accelerating or jumping in any detectable way, simply ceasing to exist in that location. For a brief moment, nothing happened. Then the first Keth ship disappeared. No explosion, no signal, no debris, just gone, followed seconds later by another, and another, as panic overtook the fleet. Attempts to retreat failed immediately as engines refused to respond, leaving the ships trapped and blind as something unseen moved among them. Within less than a minute, the entire patrol was gone, erased so completely that no trace remained. The few fragmented reports that managed to reach Central Command carried a single, chilling conclusion. The humans were not fighting in any conventional sense. They were removing targets as if they were errors in a system that had already been rewritten. As reports from across the galaxy began to align, a pattern emerged that was far more disturbing than any single loss could explain, because every encounter followed the same sequence: disruption, isolation, and erasure, executed with a level of precision that suggested complete understanding of every system it targeted. Fleets found their communications severed moments before contact. Defensive networks failed just as threats appeared, and entire installations vanished before alarms could even register. There was no randomness, no inefficiency, no wasted motion, only a systematic dismantling of infrastructure that had taken civilizations thousands of years to build. High Chancellor Marcus Viril stood in the command chamber of the Keth Dominion, watching as fragmented data painted a picture he could barely comprehend, his earlier confidence replaced by a growing sense of inevitability. This was not an invasion in the traditional sense, not an overwhelming force pushing through defenses, but something far more calculated, something that bypassed strength entirely. General Threx demanded to know where the human fleet was, where the main force had to be, but Marcus already understood the answer before it was spoken aloud. There was no fleet, not in the way they expected, because the humans were not engaging in direct confrontation. They were attacking the underlying structure that made those confrontations possible. Without communication, fleets could not coordinate. Without coordination, strength meant nothing. Without functioning systems, even the most advanced warships were reduced to drifting metal. Another transmission forced its way onto the display, overriding every security protocol as if those protections no longer existed. The same human appeared again, his expression unchanged, his presence almost unnerving in its calmness. He spoke not as someone issuing threats, but as someone describing a process already underway. "You are experiencing loss of coordination, loss of control," he said, his tone even and measured. Marcus stepped forward, demanding to know what they were, what kind of technology could do this, but the answer he received was as simple as it was unsettling. Efficient. The word hung in the air long after the transmission ended, because it carried a truth no one wanted to accept. This was not chaos, not destruction driven by rage or desperation. It was efficiency taken to its absolute extreme. Every action served a purpose, every target was chosen for maximum impact, and every second of the operation was accounted for. On Earth, Ethan Cole monitored the progression with quiet focus, making adjustments as needed, optimizing performance, reducing engagement times, refining a system that had already surpassed anything the galaxy had ever encountered. The timer continued to count down, each passing second bringing the operation closer to completion. Humanity had not entered the war as the weakest species. They had redefined what strength meant, shifting the battlefield from physical confrontation to systemic control, where their opponents had no defense and no understanding of the rules being used against them. By the time the countdown dropped below 2 minutes, the galaxy had begun to fracture under the weight of its own dependence on systems that no longer functioned, entire regions cut off from one another, leaders issuing commands that would never be received, fleets stranded without direction or purpose. Attempts to adapt failed almost immediately, as every workaround was anticipated and neutralized before it could be implemented. Backup networks disappeared as quickly as primary ones. Manual controls proved insufficient against disruptions that operated on a level far beyond physical hardware, and even isolated systems found themselves compromised without any clear point of entry. Panic spread unevenly, some civilizations collapsing into disorder, while others attempted to maintain control through sheer force of will, but none of it mattered against an enemy that did not engage in direct conflict. The Keth Dominion, once a symbol of unshakable power, now struggled to maintain basic operational stability, its vast military rendered ineffective by the loss of coordination that had once been its greatest strength. Marcus Viril stood in silence as the final reports arrived, each one confirming what he had already begun to accept, that this was not a war they could fight, not because they lacked power, but because their power was irrelevant in the face of what humanity had become. The realization settled over him with a clarity that was almost cold, stripping away denial and leaving only understanding. Humans had not challenged the galaxy to prove their strength. They had exposed its weakness. Every empire, every fleet, every advanced system had been built on the assumption that the underlying network would always function, that communication would always be possible, that coordination could always be maintained. Humanity had taken that assumption and turned it into a vulnerability, one that could be exploited with devastating effect. Another human signal appeared briefly, not as a warning or a threat, but as a confirmation that the process was nearing completion. There was no urgency in it, no sign of strain or resistance, only the steady progression of a plan that had already accounted for every possible outcome. On Earth, Ethan watched as the final phase initialized, systems activating that had remained dormant until this exact moment, their purpose hidden even from those who had helped build them. This was the part no one outside humanity would ever fully understand, the culmination of decades of preparation, research, and quiet development carried out under the assumption that one day, the galaxy would turn its attention toward Earth. That day had come, and humanity had responded not with desperation, but with a level of preparation so complete that the outcome had been decided long before the first shot was fired. As the final minute began, the remaining fragments of galactic order clung to stability out of habit rather than control, systems flickering between functionality and failure as if reality itself was struggling to maintain consistency. Fleets that had once dominated entire regions now drifted aimlessly, their crews reduced to observers of a process they could neither influence nor escape. Across countless worlds, the realization spread that this was not a temporary disruption, not an attack that could be repelled or endured, but a fundamental shift in the balance of power that had already reached its conclusion. The absence of resistance was not due to a lack of will, but a lack of opportunity, because every attempt to respond had been anticipated and neutralized before it could take effect. High Chancellor Marcus Viril stood alone as the command chamber fell silent around him, the systems he had relied on for decades now reduced to unreliable fragments. His authority rendered meaningless in the face of a force that operated beyond the structures he had spent his life mastering. For the first time, he understood the true meaning of the Human Declaration, not as a challenge, but as a statement of fact. The war had not begun with the transmission. It had ended with it. On Earth, Ethan Cole watched the countdown reach its final seconds, his expression unchanged as the last phase completed and the system confirmed what he had already known would happen. Engagement time. 7 minutes. Objective status. Achieved. Across the galaxy, the disruptions stabilized, not because they had been resolved, but because there was nothing left to disrupt. The systems that remained operational did so under conditions humanity now controlled, their functionality dependent on parameters that could be altered at any moment. The human ships that had appeared throughout the conflict were gone, leaving no trace behind, no evidence of their presence beyond the absence they had created. There was no victory announcement, no celebration, no display of dominance, only a quiet return to silence as the operation concluded exactly as planned. For those who had survived, the understanding came slowly but inevitably that humanity had never intended to fight as they did, never intended to match strength with strength or fleet with fleet. They had chosen a different battlefield, one that rendered traditional power meaningless and turned the galaxy's greatest advantages into its greatest weaknesses. The weakest species had not become strong in the way others understood. They had redefined strength entirely, proving that power was not measured by size or force, but by control, precision, and the ability to decide the outcome of a conflict before it truly began. And in 7 minutes, without a single conventional battle, they had won. Even after the 7 minutes ended, no one moved. Across the galaxy, fleets remained frozen in place, not because they were ordered to, but because the systems they relied on had never truly returned to their control. Power flickered inconsistently, navigation grids responded with delays, and communication networks, those that still functioned, operated under strange limitations no one could override. It was as if something invisible still held everything together, quietly deciding what was allowed to work and what wasn't. On the Keth flagship, Marcus Viril stood in silence, staring at the dim displays, his mind trying to process a reality that no longer followed the rules he had trusted his entire life. Reports came in slowly, fragmented and uncertain, confirming that the attack had stopped, but not reversed. Lost fleets had not reappeared. Erased stations remained empty voids. Entire sectors were quiet in a way that felt unnatural, like a pause in something much larger. General Threx broke the silence first, his voice strained. "They've stopped," he said, though it sounded more like a question than a statement. Marcus didn't respond immediately. He was watching a system map that had once been filled with motion and connection, now reduced to isolated points of light, each one uncertain, each one vulnerable. "No," he said finally. "They've finished." That word settled heavily over the room. Finished didn't mean over. It meant complete. It meant the objective had been achieved. And whatever that objective was, it had never required total destruction. It had required control. Far away, on worlds that had once been confident in their place within the galaxy, leaders gathered in emergency councils, their authority shaken by the realization that their power had been bypassed entirely. They had not been defeated in battle. They had been made irrelevant. Attempts to analyze what had happened only deepened the unease, because every piece of evidence pointed to the same conclusion. Humanity had not attacked randomly or emotionally. Every action had been calculated with impossible precision, targeting critical systems in a sequence that maximized collapse while minimizing effort. It wasn't brute force. It was understanding on a level no one else had ever reached. On Earth, Ethan Cole remained in the control room, the glow of the remaining active systems reflecting faintly across his face. Around him, The facility was quieter now, the constant hum of synchronized processes fading into a steady, controlled rhythm. The operation had ended exactly on time, every phase executed within predicted margins, every outcome matching the models that had been refined for years. He reviewed the final data not with excitement, but with confirmation. There were no surprises, no unexpected variables, just results. One of the operators hesitated before speaking. "Sir, what happens now?" Ethan didn't answer immediately. His eyes moved across the galaxy map, now simplified, stabilized under a new set of parameters that only Earth fully understood. "Now," he said quietly, "they decide how they want to exist." The operator frowned. "Sir." Ethan finally looked away from the screen. "We didn't destroy them," he said. "We showed them what they depend on." Back in the Keth Dominion, Marcus reached the same conclusion without hearing those words. This had not been annihilation. It had been a demonstration, a message far clearer than the original transmission. Humanity had proven that every system, every network, every structure the galaxy relied on could be turned off at will. And if it could be turned off, it could be controlled. The realization settled deeper than fear. Fear could be resisted. This couldn't. This was certainty. For the first time in generations, the galaxy was not asking who was the strongest. It was asking something far more dangerous. Who was in control? The first response did not come as an attack. It came as a question. A single transmission, carefully routed through the limited channels that still functioned, reached Earth hours after the 7 minutes ended. It wasn't aggressive, and it wasn't mocking. It was cautious, measured. "State your terms." The message originated from a coalition of smaller systems, species that had survived by adapting rather than dominating, and who had understood faster than most that resistance was meaningless without understanding. On Earth, the message appeared in the control room without any alarm, as if it had been expected all along. Ethan read it once, then signaled for a reply channel to open. There was no rush, no urgency, just the same calm precision that had defined every action so far. When the response was sent, it carried none of the hostility the galaxy had feared. "There are no terms," it read. That answer spread quickly, carried through whatever communication paths remained, reaching leaders who had been preparing for demands, for ultimatums, for domination. Instead, they found something far more unsettling. There was no negotiation because there was no need for one. Humanity wasn't trying to rule the galaxy. They were removing the possibility of being threatened by it. Confusion followed, mixed with disbelief, because the idea didn't fit any known pattern of power. If not control, then what was the purpose? The answer came not through words, but through change. Slowly, systems across the galaxy began to stabilize, not returning to their original state, but adapting to a new structure. Communication networks reactivated under different protocols, ones that could not be overridden or redirected without permission that no empire possessed. Defense systems came back online, but with limitations that prevented large-scale coordination for offensive purposes. Fleets regained navigation, but not the ability to mobilize in the massive formations that had once defined galactic warfare. It was subtle, almost invisible at first, but undeniable once understood. The galaxy had not been destroyed. It had been reshaped. Back in the Keth command chamber, Marcus watched as system after system came back to life under these new constraints, his expression no longer filled with shock, but with something closer to reluctant clarity. "They've rewritten the rules," Threx said quietly. Marcus nodded. "And we can't change them." On Earth, Ethan observed the same process from the other side, monitoring the reintegration as carefully as the initial disruption. This phase was just as important, perhaps even more so, because it determined what came next. Humanity had proven its capability. Now it was defining its intention. Not conquest, not destruction. Stability, but not the kind that relied on trust or alliances. The kind enforced by design. One of the operators looked at him again. "Sir, what if they try again?" Ethan's answer came without hesitation. "They won't," he said, and for the first time there was a faint shift in his expression. Not pride, not satisfaction, but certainty. Because the galaxy had just learned something it would never forget. The weakest species had not risen to power. They had made power itself obsolete. In the days that followed, the silence that settled across the galaxy was not empty, but heavy with awareness, the kind that lingers after something irreversible has already taken place. Civilizations that had once measured their strength in fleets and firepower now found those measures meaningless, replaced by a quiet dependence on systems they no longer fully understood or controlled. Trade routes resumed slowly, cautiously, as if the very act of movement required permission, and while no visible force enforced these new limitations, every attempt to bypass them failed with quiet precision. Ships that tried to coordinate in forbidden patterns lost navigation. Networks that attempted to reroute beyond allowed thresholds simply shut down. There were no warnings, no retaliation, just immediate correction, as if the galaxy itself had been rewritten to reject certain behaviors. On countless worlds, leaders stood before their people without answers, their authority diminished not by defeat, but by irrelevance, because decisions no longer shaped outcomes in the way they once had. High Chancellor Marcus Viril spent those days in observation rather than command, watching as the Dominion adapted to a reality where control had become an illusion. His earlier resistance replaced by a cold acceptance that what had happened could not be undone. Reports confirmed that no species had been singled out, no empire uniquely targeted. The changes applied equally across all known space, enforcing a balance that no one could dominate and no one could escape. It was not peace in any traditional sense, because it had not been negotiated or agreed upon, but it was undeniably stable, held in place by a system that did not rely on trust, fear, or diplomacy. On Earth, far beneath the surface, Ethan Cole continued his work in the same quiet manner as before, reviewing data streams that reflected a galaxy settling into its new structure. His role unchanged despite the scale of what had been achieved. There were no celebrations, no announcements to mark the transformation, because from his perspective, nothing unexpected had occurred. This outcome had always been the objective, defined long before the first system had been disrupted, long before the first human ship had appeared in hostile space. The difference now was that the rest of the galaxy had finally seen it. One of the analysts approached him with a question that had begun to circulate among the small team that understood even a fraction of the system's design. "Is it permanent?" Ethan considered the question for a moment, not because the answer was unclear, but because of what it implied. "It's stable," he said finally, "as long as it needs to be." That answer carried more weight than the analyst expected, because it suggested something beyond simple control, something adaptive, something capable of responding to change without direct input. And that, more than anything else, explained why no one had tried to resist again. Across the galaxy, the lesson had settled into something deeper than fear, deeper than respect, something closer to instinct. The understanding that any attempt to return to the old ways would not be met with war, but with quiet failure, systems refusing to comply, reality itself rejecting the effort. It was not oppression, because nothing forced obedience. It was design, shaping outcomes without confrontation, guiding behavior without visible enforcement. Marcus Viril stood once more before the vast observation window of his flagship, looking out at a fleet that still existed, still functioned, but no longer represented the power it once had. He understood now that humanity had not taken that power for themselves. They had removed its relevance entirely, and in doing so, they had achieved something no empire in history ever had. not dominance, but finality. The end of escalation. The end of endless cycles of conflict that had defined the galaxy for as long as records existed. It was a conclusion no one had expected, delivered by a species no one had feared. And somewhere, far from the worlds that would spend generations trying to understand what had been done to them, humanity continued forward without announcement or acknowledgement, having reshaped the structure of an entire galaxy in 7 minutes, and leaving behind a reality where war was no longer something that could be declared, only something that had already been made impossible.